The candles in the Regent's ballroom had been burning for 4 hours, and the heat they produced was no longer warmth but weight, a dense, accumulated pressure that pressed against every bare shoulder and powdered neck in the room, that made the crystal drops of the chandeliers seem to tremble, not from the movement of dancing, but from the sheer effort of holding themselves together against it. The scent was beeswax and hothouse roses and the particular sweetness of 400 people who had dressed too carefully for a room that had long since exceeded its comfortable capacity. Every gown present was white or palest gold or the most carefully considered blush, because this was the 15th of February in the year 1814, and the Regent's winter ball was the single most observed event of the season, and to wear the wrong color to it was to hand your enemies a brush and ask them to paint you with it. And at the edge of all that calculated magnificence, seated at a small writing table behind the third pillar on the eastern wall, checking the evening's supper arrangement against a handwritten list she had revised 4 times since Tuesday, was Miss Eleanor Voss. She wore gray, not silver, which might have been mistaken for a choice. Gray, the deliberate gray of a woman who had learned that the best way to move through rooms like this one was to become, in them, something structural, a pillar, a piece of furniture, the sort of thing that held the event upright without anyone thinking to put a name on it. The list in her hand was her cousin Arabella's list, Arabella Forsyth, who was at this moment the most observed debutante in the room, positioned at the center of the dancing floor in a gown that had required 3 fittings and a London dressmaker who charged what Eleanor had calculated was approximately 4 times what the Forsyth estate could comfortably absorb this quarter. Eleanor had done that calculation 3 weeks ago, in the account ledger she kept under the writing desk in the morning room that everyone used as a storage room because it had a broken window latch and no fire. She had also drafted the letter to the dressmaker's account, negotiated the payment in 2 installments rather than 1, and arranged for the first installment to come from the wool revenue that she had renegotiated in November, when the original merchant contract had expired, and no one else in the household had noticed. No one had thanked her for any of it. She had not expected them to. She picked up her pen and made a small mark beside the entry for the lobster patties. Confirmed, 12 dozen, arriving at 10 o'clock from the Forsyth kitchen, and continued down the list. That was when the room shifted. It did not shift loudly. There was no announcement, no particular swell in the music. The orchestra simply continued its measured work, and the dancing continued, and the 400 people in their white and gold and blush continued their patterns. And then a door opened on the far side of the room, and everyone who had been facing that direction rearranged themselves, very slightly, into a different configuration. The way iron filings arrange themselves around a magnet, the way a room of people responds to the arrival of something that has weight. Eleanor looked up. He was tall and dark-coated in a room full of men who were also tall and also dark-coated, and yet he was distinctly not the same as any of them. The difference was not in the coat, which was excellent but not unusual, or in the cravat, which was white and precisely tied, and she noticed this from 20 feet away, because she noticed everything, already slightly off-center to the left. The difference was in how he moved through the room, not pausing to perform attention for anyone, not scanning for the next useful face, but proceeding with the measured economy of a man who had decided before he arrived exactly how long he would stay and exactly what he would do with the time. He was Edward Cavendish, the Duke of Ashmore. She knew this not because she had been watching for him, but because she had prepared the evening's placement list, which included his name, and because there was no other man in England to whom 400 people would quietly rearrange themselves in exactly that way. He crossed the room. He did not look at Arabella, who was in the direct path of his crossing, and who was wearing a gown that had been specifically designed to be looked at. He did not look at Lady Harriet Mowbray, who was positioned near the fireplace at the precise angle that would catch the light most favorably, and who had, Eleanor had heard, considered this season's ball her most likely opportunity. He looked at none of the things the room had arranged itself to show him. He looked with the steady and particular attention of a man identifying something he had not expected to find, at the woman behind the third pillar on the eastern wall. Eleanor Voss looked back at him for 3 full seconds. Then she returned to her list. The lobster patties were confirmed. The seating for supper required one adjustment. She made a note. She had not come from nothing, though the Forsyths had spent 5 years constructing the impression that she had. The truth was that her father, George Voss, had been a solicitor of considerable skill and modest means, a man who had treated the law the way some men treated mathematics, as a system of elegant internal logic that rewarded patience and precise attention. Eleanor had grown up at his desk, more or less. She had spent her childhood reading contracts the way other children read fairy stories, not because her father pushed her to, but because the contracts were there, and they were interesting, and she found, at around the age of 11, that she could see the problems in them before he pointed them out. "There," she had said once, pressing her finger to a clause in a property transfer agreement that a client had brought in a panic. "This term is ambiguous. 2 possible readings, and the seller's solicitor has written it to favor the second one, while presenting it as though it only has one." Her father had read the clause again, slowly. Then he had looked at her the way she would spend the next 20 years waiting for other people to look at her, with the expression of someone who has just correctly identified something they did not expect to find. "You are quite right," he had said, and then he had fixed it. And the client had been spared an expensive misreading, and George Voss had written Eleanor's observation into his notes as though it were simply part of his own thinking. She had not minded, as she had been 12. She had understood that the credit would go where it went. Her father died when she was 17, of a fever that moved too quickly for the doctor to do anything useful about it, and left behind him a modest house, a modest practice, and an estate that turned out to be less modest than Eleanor had understood, not in wealth but in complexity. There were debts she had not known about, 3 outstanding contracts that required resolution, and a household that needed someone to make decisions about it immediately. Eleanor had made them. She had spent 6 weeks reading every document in his office, cross-referencing his accounts, writing to every creditor in clear and organized terms about what would be paid, and when, and why. 2 of the 3 creditors had written back with something close to respect. The third had threatened legal action and received, in return, a 6-page letter from Eleanor, demonstrating that the original agreement had been improperly constructed and would not survive examination. He had not written again. She had done all of this at 17, without a solicitor of her own, because the only solicitor she could afford was herself, and she had learned from the best one she knew. Her father's cousin, Thomas Forsyth, had arrived while she was still reorganizing the estate, and had presented the situation as a kindness. Eleanor could come and live with the Forsyths, who had a large house in Wiltshire and 3 daughters of marriageable age, and a staff that needed managing. She would have a home. She would have security. She understood, without Thomas explaining it, that she would also have work. She had said yes because she was 17, and the house had to be sold and she had no other offer. She had understood, even then, that she was accepting not rescue but a different set of terms. That had been 7 years ago. In those 7 years, Eleanor had managed the Forsyth household accounts with a precision that had, by her 3rd year, recovered the family from the quiet edge of ruin that Thomas had not known enough about numbers to recognize he was standing on. She had renegotiated the wool merchant contract twice. She had found the discrepancy in the tenant farm rents, a systematic underreporting that had been in place for at least a decade, small enough per quarter that no one had noticed it accumulating, and corrected it without making the discovery public. because public discovery would have required an investigation, and an investigation would have required a solicitor, and a solicitor would have required payment, and the recovery itself was sufficient. She had written the letter to Arabella's London dressmaker. She had organized 4 seasons' worth of social events, from the placement lists, to the supper arrangements, to the management of hired staff on the evenings themselves. She had done all of it from the morning room with the broken window latch, working by candlelight in winter because the room had no fire, in a household where her name appeared on no document of authority. There had been a moment, in the 2nd year, when she had been close to something she would not have called despair but that occupied the same neighborhood. The accounts had come right that month for the first time. The wool contract had gone through, and she had sat in the cold morning room at midnight and understood, with complete clarity, that she had just saved a family that would never acknowledge she had done it. She had pressed one hand flat against the desk and held it there, and thought about what it would mean to simply stop, to let the accounts slide, to let someone else find the tenant farm discrepancy. And then she had decided, in the particular quiet way that decisions are made when they are not really decisions but reckonings with one's own nature, that she was not going to do that. Not because the Forsyths deserved her best work. They did not, particularly. But because the work itself deserved to be done correctly, and she was the one doing it, and she was not going to become less than she was to suit the convenience of people who had not thought to look at her. She had picked up her pen. She had continued. There was one person who had looked at her, in those 7 years. Mrs. Aldridge, the Forsyth housekeeper, who was 63 and had been in the household longer than anyone else in it, had appeared in the doorway of the cold morning room one evening, in January of Eleanor's 2nd year, and said, without preamble, "You have been keeping this family from the bailiff since before Christmas, and you know it, and I know it, and that will have to be enough, for now." Then she had brought Eleanor a cup of tea and a piece of bread and gone back to her own work. Eleanor had not known, then, that the observation would need to last her for years. She had filed it away carefully, the way she filed everything useful, and gone back to the accounts. The Duke of Ashmore had not attended a season's event in 4 years. This was known. It was known the way all things about a duke are known, not because he had announced it, but because he hadn't appeared. And the absence of something so consistently observed becomes its own variety of fact. He had been at Ashmore Park since the winter of 1810, following his mother's death, managing an estate that had suffered during the years of his father's declining attentiveness, and that required, as he had understood immediately upon inheriting, a great deal of concentrated work before it could be presented to the world as the thing it needed to be. He had done that work. He was not a man who left work to other people when he could do it himself. What had brought him back to London in February of 1814 was not the season. He had received, 3 months earlier, a report from Mr. Aldous Brant, a man he employed for the specific purpose of finding information that was not publicly available, that contained, among several items of considerably less interest, a single paragraph about the household management practices of the Forsyth family of Wiltshire. The paragraph noted that the Forsyth estate's financial recovery over the preceding 5 years appeared to correlate with the arrival of a female relation who functioned in an administrative capacity, that this relation had renegotiated 2 merchant contracts and corrected a systematic discrepancy in tenant farm accounts, and that she held no formal authority over the household and received no formal compensation beyond room and board. He had read the paragraph 4 times. He had then asked Brant for a second report, this one specific, the name, the history, the particular details. Brant had delivered it 6 weeks later. Eleanor Catherine Voss, 24 years of age, daughter of George Voss, solicitor. The facts of her father's death, the estate management at 17, the Forsyth arrangement. Brant had included, in a footnote he seemed uncertain whether to include, a comment from a Forsyth housemaid who had been interviewed at a distance. She notices everything. She never misses a thing, and she never says a word about it. The Duke of Ashmore had read this and thought, for the first time in 4 years, that there might be a reason to go to London. His own household, Ashmore Park, 600 acres of Shropshire, the London house that had been shut for 4 years, the associated properties in Yorkshire and Surrey, had recovered under his own hand from the state his father's inattentiveness had left it in. But the recovery was structural. The estate functioned now as it should, and it would continue to function in the short term because he had built the systems to sustain it. What it did not have was the kind of intelligence that could see what he could not see, could find the second-order problem before it became visible, could manage the texture of a household the way his mother had managed it, not as administration but as genuine understanding. He had not been looking for a wife. He had, if he was precise about it, been looking for a quality he did not know how to name, until Brant's report gave him the particular example that made him understand what it was. He had come to the Regent's ball because the Forsyths were attending, which he had confirmed through a discreet inquiry to the evening's host, and because he wanted to see, not Arabella Forsyth, who had been suggested to him by 2 separate matrons as a likely candidate, and not the arrangement of the thing, but the woman behind the arrangement, the one whose name appeared on no document of authority. He had found her behind the 3rd pillar, checking a list. He had stood in the corridor outside the Forsyths' rented rooms the following morning, waiting for a reasonable hour to leave his card, and overheard, through a door that was not quite closed, a voice reading aloud from a ledger to itself, making small corrections in a murmur that was entirely self-contained and entirely absorbed, the way a person sounds when they have forgotten that other people exist. The voice was precise. It was also, underneath the precision, tired in a way that it was not performing. He had left his card. He had waited. When the invitation to take tea was extended, he had accepted it, and he had spent 40 minutes in the Forsyth drawing room, doing what he had done at the ball, looking past the arranged surface at the woman managing the arrangement, who was sitting 3 feet to the left of Arabella and Arabella's mother, pouring tea that no one had asked her to pour, and which no one thanked her for, and who looked up once and met his eyes, and then looked immediately back down at the teacup she was filling. He had come back the following day and asked, with the specific intention of asking her rather than her cousin, whether Miss Voss would be willing to walk in the park. She had said yes with the expression of a woman who was not entirely certain this was actually happening. He had also, in the 2 weeks between the ball and his request, arranged for his London solicitor, Mr. Graham, to pull the public records on the Forsyth estate's merchant contracts from the past 5 years. He had read them on a Thursday evening. He had found, in the second contract revision, a clause that was not standard. That was, in fact, the kind of precisely constructed non-standard language that a person writes when they have read a great deal of contract law and have identified an instrument that does not yet exist in common practice and have quietly invented it. The clause protected the Forsyth estate from a particular variety of merchant default that had ruined 3 other families in the same wool-producing region in the past decade. No solicitor's name was attached to it. The contract was signed by Thomas Forsyth. Edward Cavendish had looked at that clause for a long time. Then he had put the contract down and gone to stand at the window and looked out at the street, and thought about what it meant to build something careful and solid and place someone else's name above the door. He had made up his mind then, not with drama. He was not a dramatic man, but with the kind of quiet finality that comes when a decision has been reached through a long process of examination, and the examination is complete. He had attended the Regent's ball. He had danced with Lady Harriet Mowbray once, because the social obligation required it, and he was not a man who ignored social obligations when they could be discharged efficiently. And then he had crossed the ballroom to where Eleanor Voss was sitting with her list, and said, simply, "Miss Voss, I wonder if you would do me the honor." She had looked up at him. The expression on her face was the same one she had worn in the drawing room, the particular stillness of a person who is waiting to understand whether something real is happening. "The season rules permit one dance," she said, and it was not a refusal. It was an observation, the statement of a fact, delivered without either hope or disappointment, by someone who had been trained by long experience to understand the actual terms of any given arrangement. "I am aware of the rules," he had said. They had danced. It was a country dance, which meant they were together and apart in the formal alternation that the form required. And in the apart moments he watched her and she did not quite watch him. And in the together moments she was exactly as composed and exactly as precise as every other thing he had observed about her. And when the music stopped, she thanked him in a voice that gave nothing away and returned to the eastern wall. He danced with her again an hour later. The room noticed this. The room was, in fact, constituted specifically for the purpose of noticing things like this. And the Duke dancing with the same woman twice. Not the debutante, not Lady Harriet Mowbray, who had positioned herself so precisely near the fireplace, but the woman in gray behind the third pillar, was the kind of information that moved through 400 people with the quiet efficiency of water finding its level. Eleanor felt the shift in the room before she heard any specific word. She felt it the way she felt most things, as a change in pressure, a subtle rearrangement of the quality of attention around her. She did not look up from her list. She finished her notes on the supper arrangement and folded the paper. He came for her a third time. "Your Grace," she said, and now her voice was careful in a different way. "The season permits one." "I know what the season permits," he said. He extended his hand. He did not perform the extension. He simply held it there, at the distance of a request. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She was not going to pretend she did not understand what 3 dances meant in this room, in this season, in front of these 400 people. She understood it precisely. "Then you are doing something deliberate," she said. "Yes," he said. She took his hand. The music was a waltz, a deliberate choice, she understood later, though she did not know at the time how thoroughly deliberate it was. And the waltz placed them close enough that she could see, for the first time, that the cravat she had noticed from 20 feet away, at the beginning of the evening, was still slightly off-center. She said nothing about it during the dance. She was composing herself. She was managing the pressure of being looked at, for the first time in 7 years, by 400 people who had the specific attention of having just seen something unexpected. When the dance ended, he held her hand 1 beat longer than the form required. "There will be consequences," she said quietly. "For me, if not for you." "I know," he said. "I intend to address them." Lady Harriet Mowbray watched from the fireplace with an expression that had not quite settled. Arabella Forsyth watched from the dance floor with an expression that had not quite formulated. Thomas Forsyth, who had been drinking claret near the supper-room entrance, set down his glass. Eleanor Voss returned to the third pillar. She picked up her list. She was not going to pretend the list was interesting, but she was going to hold it until her hands were steady. She had managed harder things than this. She could manage this. The days following the ball had the particular quality of a calculation whose terms had changed. Lady Harriet Mowbray had not said anything directly to Eleanor. They were not acquainted, and Lady Harriet was not the kind of woman who delivered her opinions to women in gray. But Eleanor had heard enough, through the ordinary mechanics of a rented townhouse with thin walls, and Arabella's habit of relating everything she'd been told, to understand that the situation had arranged itself along the lines she'd expected. The Duke had behaved in an extraordinary way. The extraordinary behavior had been observed. The observation had produced opinions, and the opinions were divided precisely along the line of self-interest. Those who had something to lose from the Duke's interest in Eleanor Voss were certain it was a passing eccentricity, and those who had nothing in particular invested were simply curious. Thomas Forsyth's position was the first complication. He had appeared in the morning room the day after the ball, the cold morning room, where Eleanor had been awake since 6 o'clock with the accounts, and stood in the doorway with the expression of a man who has been presented with a piece of information that does not fit any of his existing categories. "The Duke of Ashmore danced with you 3 times, he said. "He did," Eleanor agreed. Thomas Forsyth looked at the ledger on her desk. He looked at the window latch, which was still broken. He looked at Eleanor. He was not a malicious man, which was the most she could honestly say in his favor. He was a man of conventional expectations, who had spent 7 years not looking at what was in front of him, and he was now looking at it with the specific discomfort of someone who has realized he may have significantly misread a situation. "The Duke is seeking a wife," he said. "That is the general understanding," Eleanor said. "He danced with Arabella's companion 3 times. He danced with me," Eleanor said, with the precision of someone correcting an important classification error. "Arabella and I are cousins, not employer and companion, though I recognize the distinction has not been practically observed." Thomas Forsyth's mouth opened and then closed. He looked at the ledger again. "You've kept the accounts," he said. It was not precisely a question. "For 7 years," Eleanor said, "among other things." He left without saying anything further. Eleanor returned to the accounts. The reckoning of what Thomas Forsyth had or had not understood about his household survival was not, she decided, today's most pressing item. Today's most pressing item was a letter she had received that morning from Ashmore's solicitor, a Mr. Graham, requesting her availability for a conversation at her earliest convenience. She had read the letter twice, confirmed that it said what she thought it said, and was composing her response when Thomas Forsyth had interrupted. She finished the response now. Yes, she was available. Tomorrow morning, at 10 o'clock, if that was suitable. Mr. Graham arrived at 10 o'clock, accompanied by a young clerk who carried a leather case and looked around the cold morning room with the expression of a person who had expected something different. Mr. Graham himself was 60, compact, professionally pleasant, and had the slightly adjusted posture of a man who has been asked to proceed in a situation that is not quite standard and has decided to proceed with full professionalism regardless. "Miss Voss," he said, "His Grace the Duke of Ashmore has asked me to convey several items to you and to make certain inquiries, with your permission." "You may make your inquiries," Eleanor said. The inquiries were, in their way, extraordinary. Not because they were improper, they were conducted with perfect correctness, but because they were thorough. Mr. Graham asked about her understanding of estate management. He asked about her experience with merchant contracts, but he asked, with a delicacy that she recognized as genuine rather than performed, whether she had any existing legal obligations to the Forsyth household that would require resolution. She answered each question precisely. At the end of the conversation, Mr. Graham placed a document on the desk. It was a preliminary framework, not a formal contract, he was careful to explain, but a structure for one, outlining the terms of a proposed arrangement that the Duke of Ashmore wished her to consider. The arrangement was a proposal of marriage, set out in the practical language of a document rather than the performative language of a drawing room. It included provisions for her independent management of a household account, a formal acknowledgement of her administrative capacity in the estate records, and a clause, she read this twice, that specifically protected her ability to engage in professional advisory work with neighboring estates, should she choose to do so. She read the document for 12 minutes. Mr. Graham waited. "This clause," she said, placing her finger on the 3rd page, "this is not standard." "No," Mr. Graham agreed. He seemed to be carefully not smiling. "He wrote this specifically," she said. "I am not in a position to comment on the drafting process," Mr. Graham said. He was definitely not smiling. "I can confirm that the clause is as you see it." Eleanor looked at the clause for another moment. Then she folded the document carefully and handed it back. "I will give the Duke my answer when I have considered it completely," she said. "I do not make decisions of this magnitude immediately." "His Grace anticipated that," Mr. Graham said, rising. "He asks only that you take the time you require." He came himself, 3 days later, not with Mr. Graham and not with any formal arrangement. He came to the house in the early afternoon and asked, through the footman, whether Miss Voss was available to walk. She was. She put on her coat and went down the stairs past Arabella, who was standing in the entrance hall with the expression of a woman watching something she had not prepared herself to watch. They walked in the park. The February air was cold enough that their breath made small clouds, and the path was mostly empty, and he walked beside her at a pace that was calibrated exactly to hers, which she noticed because very few people thought to do it. "The clause on the 3rd page," she said, without prelude. "I read the Forsyth merchant contract," he said, "the second revision, the non-standard language." She was quiet for a moment. The path curved around a bare-branched tree. "That clause has protected the Forsyth estate from a default scenario that ruined 3 neighboring wool producers," she said. "I invented it because the standard form did not have an instrument for the specific risk I identified." "I know," he said. "Thomas Forsyth signed it," she said. "I know that too," he said. She pressed one hand briefly against her coat, at the place where the cold was coming through, and continued walking. "The clause on the 3rd page of your solicitor's document," she said. "The one that acknowledges my administrative capacity in the estate records. That is not a standard provision." "No," he said. "You are offering me," she said slowly, "a legal record of what I have done, not for what I will do, for what I have already done." "Among other things," he said. Eleanor did not say anything for a moment. The park path was quiet. Somewhere ahead of them a sparrow was conducting a fierce and private argument with a bare shrub. "I have not said yes," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to say yes yet. I am asking you to walk." They walked for an hour. When he returned her to the house, he took her gloved hand and held it for a moment, and then released it, and said that he would leave the question with her as long as she required. She stood in the doorway of the morning room that evening and looked at the ledger on the desk. She had been in this room for 7 years. The window latch was still broken. The chair she sat in had a cracked crossbar she had repaired herself with a wedge of spare wood from the garden shed because she had not wanted to make the request to the household accounts. She had managed this. She could manage a life that was built differently. She did not say yes that evening. She thought about it for 4 more days, with the complete attention she gave to everything. Inside Ashmore House, the London residence, reopened and rehung with fresh linen and new candles for the first time in 4 years, Eleanor met, in the 2 weeks that followed their park walk, the 3 people who would matter most to her understanding of whether the life she was considering was the life she thought it was. The first was Mrs. Laura Havers, the Ashmore housekeeper, who appeared on Eleanor's first invited visit with a cup of tea that was exactly the right temperature and a direct gaze that communicated, without any particular warmth or any particular coldness, that she was being assessed, and that the assessment would be fair. Mrs. Havers had managed Ashmore House alone during the 4 years of the Duke's absence, and she had done it, Eleanor noted, with the evidence of someone who took the work seriously. The house was clean in the particular way of houses where the cleaning is genuinely done rather than performed for inspection, and the accounts Mrs. Havers kept, which she showed Eleanor without being asked, after about 20 minutes of conversation, were precise in a way that Eleanor recognized. Not trained precision, native precision, the kind that comes from a person who simply cannot leave a column of figures incorrect. "You do the accounts yourself," Eleanor said. Always have, Mrs. Havers said. Eleanor looked at the ledger. She found no errors. She found, instead, a practice of annotation, small notes beside certain entries, marking a decision or a reason, that was so similar to her own practice that it was briefly startling. His Grace chose well in you, Eleanor said, and meant it as a professional observation. Mrs. Havers looked at her with the particular expression of someone deciding something. He chose carefully in the general, she said. In you specifically, I think he chose right. The second person was Mr. Edward White, who had served as the Ashmore estate advisor for 30 years, and who had a retired diplomat's quality of knowing things without appearing to have gathered them. He had come to take tea with Eleanor on her second visit, ostensibly to discuss the estate's Yorkshire property, and had spent 40 minutes conducting a conversation that was simultaneously about Yorkshire sheep yields and about nothing whatsoever to do with sheep yields, in the way of someone who is evaluating a candidate through the thing they discuss, rather than the discussion itself. At the end of the 40 minutes, Mr. White said, "The Forsyth wool contract. Second revision. I read it last week. The yield protection clause." "Yes," Eleanor said. "Has that form been adopted by any other estate in your region?" "It hasn't," Eleanor said. "It should be. I have considered writing it up as a general instrument, but it was not my name on the contract, and the document didn't belong to me to publish." Mr. White looked at her for a moment. "It does now," he said, "if you choose to sign one that does." The third person arrived without announcement, which was consistent with her nature. Miss Charlotte Pearson was the daughter of a Shropshire baronet, the Duke's nearest neighbor at Ashmore Park, and she had come to London for the season with the specific intention of seeing her old friend the Duke back in circulation, and she had arrived at Ashmore House on a Tuesday morning, and been shown into the drawing-room where Eleanor happened to be reviewing the household's quarterly arrangement with Mr. White, and she had looked at Eleanor for approximately 3 seconds, and then said, directly and without social preamble, "Oh, you're the one. Good." "I'm not certain what I am yet," Eleanor said. "He has been alone at that estate for 4 years, Charlotte said, settling herself into a chair with the efficiency of a person who had very little patience for protocol. "He works every day and he reads every evening, and there is not a single person in his orbit who says anything directly to him. The staff adore him, but they don't argue with him. I visit twice a year and I argue with him, but I go home. He needed someone with a spine made of something useful. So, good." Eleanor considered this. "You are extremely direct," she said. "So are you," Charlotte said. "I read it in the way you said, 'I'm not certain what I am yet.' Anyone else would have said, 'You flatter me,' and looked at the floor." Eleanor's mouth did something that was almost a smile. "His cravat," she said, because she had been thinking about it since the ball. The evening of the Regent's ball. Was it, "Does he always tie it slightly off-center?" Charlotte stared at her. Then she produced a laugh that was genuine and unguarded and said, "For as long as I have known him, no one has ever said a word. His valet has never said a word. I have never said a word, because it felt impertinent. It has been off-center for approximately 40 minutes on the only occasion I have properly observed it," Eleanor said. "I did not say anything because we were dancing and it wasn't the moment." Charlotte looked at her with an expression that contained a great deal of information compressed efficiently. "Miss Voss," she said, "I think you should say yes." She had not yet, at that point, said yes. The morning it changed was a Wednesday. Eleanor had come to Ashmore House at the invitation of Mr. White to review the Yorkshire property accounts, which had a persistent discrepancy in the tenant returns that Mr. White had flagged but not been able to locate. She had been at the desk in the library for 3 hours, working through the relevant ledger with the specific attention of someone who knows where problems hide, when the Duke appeared in the doorway. He had been at the far side of the house, she understood, in a meeting with his steward. He had clearly come directly from it. His coat was still on, his gloves were in his hand, and the cravat was, she noted, still slightly off-center. He looked at her with the ledger open in front of her and said nothing. "The discrepancy is in the quarterly rounding," she said, without looking up. "Your steward has been rounding down on every third entry since 1811. Not fraudulently, I think, but habitually. The individual amounts are trivial, but the accumulation over 12 quarters is approximately 32 pounds. I have marked each instance." She turned the ledger to face him and pushed it across the desk. He came to the desk and read the marked entries. He was standing close enough that she could see that the cravat was off-center to the left by approximately the same amount as at the ball. She reached up and straightened it. It took 3 seconds. She did not comment on it. She returned her hand to the ledger. He was very still for a moment. "It has been off-center since before dinner," she said. "I noticed it when you arrived." "I know," he said. His voice was quieter than usual. "It has been off-center since before dinner at the Regent's ball." "I noticed it then, too," she said. "Why didn't you say something?" "We had just met," she said, "and you were a duke, and then we were dancing." He looked at her. He put down his gloves. "Miss Voss," he said, "I would like to make a formal proposal. Not through Mr. Graham. Directly." "I would like to hear it," she said. He did not produce a speech. He said, in the measured and unhurried way he said everything. "Not because my estate requires a competent administrator, though it does, and not because the season's mathematics demanded I express an interest, and not because you are the most operationally remarkable person I have encountered in 15 years of managing complex affairs, but because when you straightened my cravat just now, without making a production of it, without expecting anything from me, with the complete matter-of-fact attention you give to everything that needs correcting, I understood that I have been waiting a long time to be in a room with someone like that, and I would like the room to be permanent." Eleanor looked at the ledger. She looked at the corrected cravat. She thought about the morning room with the broken window latch, and the 7 years of accounts in her own handwriting under Thomas Forsyth's name, and the clause on the 3rd page of Mr. Graham's document, and Charlotte Pearson saying the word spine with the particular satisfaction of someone who meant it as a compliment. She thought about it completely. "Yes," she said. The formal announcement had required a formal occasion, and the formal occasion required navigating a set of reactions that Eleanor had anticipated and prepared for with the same attention she brought to everything else. Thomas Forsyth's reaction had come first. He had been told by the Duke privately, before any public announcement, and he had sat in the Forsyth drawing-room for a long moment, and then looked at Eleanor, with the expression of a man who is counting backward through years of decisions and arriving at a sum that is not what he thought. "You saved the estate," he said. "Not a question this time." "I managed the estate," Eleanor said. "Yes." "I didn't—" He stopped. He looked at his hands. "I thought you were simply organized." "I was more than simply organized," Eleanor said, without edge. "I managed not to make that apparent, because apparent competence in my position tends to produce inconvenient questions about credit." Thomas Forsyth looked at her for a long moment. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had not looked. The distinction, she had decided, was real, even if its practical consequences were largely identical. "You will marry a duke," he said. "I will marry Edward Cavendish," she said, "who happens to be a duke." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, slowly and without warmth but also without contempt, I ought to have, looked more carefully at what you were doing. The accounts." He stopped again. "You were owed something for that, more than you were given." "I was," Eleanor said. She let the statement stand. He nodded once and left the room, and she did not expect him to say anything further, and he did not. Lady Harriet Mowbray's position on the matter was communicated through channels rather than directly. a carefully composed letter to a mutual acquaintance, a remark at a dinner that Eleanor did not attend, a general impression that the Duke of Ashmore had acted oddly and would eventually realize it. The remarkable thing about Lady Harriet, Eleanor thought, was not that she was unpleasant, she was not, particularly, but that she was entirely the product of a system that had told her, for 25 years, that her position and her appearance and her connections were the correct currency, and she had saved and spent in that currency faithfully, and she was not wrong by the rules of her world. The rules of her world were simply not the final authority on the matter. By March, the institutional opposition had assembled in the way institutional opposition always assembles, not with a single face or a single action, but with the accumulated weight of whispered calculation. 3 of the Duke's investors in a Yorkshire mill venture, men who had a financial relationship with his estate and considered that relationship to confer certain opinions, had requested a meeting with the Duke in the second week of March to express their concerns about the match. The concerns were expressed, as such concerns always are, in the language of practicality. The Duke's social position, the importance of the right connection, the questions that would inevitably be raised about the suitability of a solicitor's daughter managing the accounts of a ducal household. The Duke had attended the meeting. Eleanor had not been invited to the meeting, but she had prepared for it, because she had known it was coming, and she was not a woman who walked into foreseeable situations unprepared. She had given Edward, the evening before the meeting, a folder of documents. The folder contained the annotated wool merchant contract from the Forsyth estate, with her authorship of the yield protection clause clearly marked in a separate explanatory note. It contained a summary of the tenant farm discrepancy discovery, with the 12 quarters of recovered income calculated to the penny. It contained the Yorkshire tenant ledger she had worked through in the Ashmore library, with every instance of systematic rounding identified and the £32 accumulation documented. It contained a 1-page memorandum she had written in the clear and organized prose she had learned from reading her father's best work, describing the principle by which the yield protection clause functioned and its potential application to 3 other estate types beyond wool production. "You don't have to use any of this," she said. "I prepared it in case it was useful." He had read through the folder in silence. Then he had looked up at her. "This is the ledger as a weapon," he said, which was such a precise articulation of what she had done that she looked at him for a moment. "My father called it organized truth," she said. "He thought the word weapon was adversarial. I think organized truth is the same thing, depending on who you're organizing it against." He had taken the folder to the meeting. He had placed the memorandum on the table in front of the 3 investors and let them read it. Then he had said, in the even and deliberate tone he used for everything, "The woman you are describing as unsuitable has invented a legal instrument that this estate and 3 neighboring estates are going to use to protect their annual revenue for the foreseeable future. She found a systematic discrepancy in your colleague Mr. Harrison's Yorkshire returns that your colleague Mr. Harrison's steward has been generating, unintentionally, for 3 years. I would suggest that the question of suitability is being applied in the wrong direction." The meeting had ended without resolution, which was its own kind of resolution. The investors had not capitulated. Men of that position did not capitulate in meetings. But they had, Eleanor understood later, encountered a version of the argument that was made entirely of specific documented fact, and specific documented fact has a quality that general prejudice does not. It persists after the conversation ends. The meeting with the Investor Council was not the public reckoning. That came 10 days later, on an evening in March when the season was reaching its social peak, and the Regent himself was hosting a formal dinner at which, by the particular social mechanics of 1814, a large number of the people who mattered to the Duke's world would be present simultaneously. Lady Harriet Mowbray was present. The 3 investors were present. Thomas Forsyth was present. Mr. White was present, in his capacity as Ashmore estate advisor. Charlotte Pearson was present, in her capacity as a Shropshire baronet's daughter and the Duke's neighbor, and she had positioned herself, Eleanor noticed, with the particular intention of someone who knows exactly where they want to be standing when something happens. Eleanor was present because the Duke had asked her to come, and because she had accepted, and because she was not going to step aside for anyone. What happened was not planned in the way of a theatrical scene. It happened because a question was asked in a room full of people, and Eleanor Voss answered it. The question came from Lord Anstruther, who was 60, who had a large estate in Hertfordshire and investments in the same Yorkshire mill venture as the three investors, and who had the specific confidence of a man who has never needed to consider whether he would be heard. He was not malicious, Lord Anstruther. He was the patriarchal gate made conversational. He asked, addressing the room rather than Eleanor specifically, in the way of someone making a point through a question rather than actually wanting an answer, how it was that the Duke of Ashmore had chosen to align himself with a young woman of such, as he put it, modest circumstances, and whether the Duke might clarify what had recommended the match to him. The room had the particular suspended quality of a room waiting to see what happens next. Edward Cavendish turned to Eleanor. He did not answer for her. He looked at her, with the expression she had learned to read in 3 months, the quiet, attending expression of someone who is making space, and he said, to her rather than to the room, "Miss Voss, would you answer Lord Anstruther's question?" She had the folder in her hand. She had carried it because she had prepared it, and because she had learned, from 17 years of practice, that you bring what you have worked on to the room where it might be needed. She set it on the table in front of her and opened it to the wool contract summary. "The question of what recommended the match," she said, in the clear and carrying voice of someone who has spent years in rooms where she had to make herself heard without raising her volume, "appears to be, in practice, a question about whether I have any professional quality that justifies the Duke of Ashmore's confidence. I will answer that question directly." She looked at Lord Anstruther, and then at the investors, and then, briefly, at Thomas Forsyth. "I managed the Forsyth estate accounts for 7 years. I renegotiated 2 merchant contracts. I identified and corrected a systematic tenant-farm discrepancy that had been accumulating for a decade. The yield protection clause in the second Forsyth wool contract, which has since protected the estate from a default scenario that has ruined 3 neighboring producers, was drafted by me. My name does not appear on that contract. I am providing this information now, with documentation, because I am not going to be in this room and allow a question about my quality to be answered by my silence." She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She presented. She turned to the specific pages in the folder as she referenced them, and she set each relevant document flat on the table so that it could be read. And she stood there with the composure of a woman who has been managing difficult conversations since she was 17, and has learned that composure is not performed, but simply the condition of someone who has done their preparation. The room did not erupt. There was a long, suspended moment. Lord Anstruther looked at the wool contract summary. He looked at the tenant farm recovery calculation. He looked at the 1-page memorandum. He was not converted. Men like Lord Anstruther are not converted in moments, and to claim otherwise would be to misread the situation. But he was, visibly and without disguising it, unable to maintain the particular posture of someone who has not been given information they recognize as competent. Edward Cavendish moved then. He did not make a speech. He walked to where Eleanor was standing, and he took the hand she had placed on the table beside the documents, and he brought it to his lips. Not the gloved back of it, but her actual hand, which she had removed her glove from because the evening was warm, and because she had needed her hands free to turn pages. And he kissed it, in front of Lord Anstruther and the 3 investors and Lady Harriet Mowbray and Thomas Forsyth and Charlotte Pearson and the assembled social weight of a regent's dinner in March of 1814. The person being overlooked in any room, he said, to the room rather than to her, in the quiet and deliberate voice that people listen to because it never performed, is often the person keeping the room standing. Charlotte Pearson, from her position near the window, was not even trying to suppress the expression on her face. Lady Harriet Mowbray looked at Eleanor Voss with the expression of a woman doing a complex recalculation, not warmly, not converted, but without the certainty she had carried in, and that mattered more than warmth. Thomas Forsyth looked at the table. Lord Anstruther said, after a moment, "The Yield Protection Clause. You invented this instrument yourself." "I did," Eleanor said. He looked at the document again. "I have 3 estates with wool production," he said. "The default scenario you've described in the memorandum is, I've seen it ruin a neighbor." He paused. "The instrument could be applied more broadly." "It can," Eleanor said. "I have described the principle. The application would require drafting for each specific contract form." Lord Anstruther looked at the Duke. He looked at Eleanor. He was not gracious about it. He was not a gracious man when taken by surprise, but he said, with the blunt, acknowledging quality of someone who is capable of reading information when it is placed directly in front of him, "I see the recommendation." The room changed, not all at once, not completely, and not in the direction of warmth. The aristocratic circle did not simply dissolve its structural prejudices in a March dinner, but in the way a room changes when a fact has been publicly established and cannot be undone. Eleanor folded the documents back into the folder and set it beside her plate, and accepted the glass of wine that a footman offered, and she was steady. He proposed to her again that night. Not the formal proposal through Mr. Graham. That had already been made and accepted. This was something else. They were standing in the entrance hall of Ashmore House at the end of the evening, having returned from the Regent's dinner, and the house was quiet and the candles were low, and he had said nothing during the carriage ride that required answering, which she had appreciated, because she had been using the silence to settle herself. He stopped at the foot of the stairs and said, "I want to say at once, without the document and without the room." She turned. "Not because it is convenient or appropriate or fitted the requirements my position imposes," he said, "but because you walked into a room full of people who had decided what you were, and you put 7 years of work on the table in front of them with your hands completely steady, and you didn't ask them to like it. You asked them to look at it. That is not something I have seen before, and I love you for it, specifically, for exactly that." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "The cravat," she said. He blinked. "It's gone off again," she said. "To the left." He looked at her. She looked at him. Then she reached up and straightened it, for the second time, in the quiet of the entrance hall, with no one watching. "Yes," she said. "I know I've already said yes. I'm saying it again." They married in April, in the small parish church at Ashmore Park, with Charlotte Pearson and Mr. White present as witnesses, and Mrs. Havers in the second pew, because she had been invited, and had attended with an expression of contained satisfaction that she did not bother to conceal. The ceremony was quiet and specific and entirely without performance. Thomas Forsyth attended. He sat in the back. He did not approach Eleanor afterward, but he had come, and she had seen him come, and she had decided that this was enough. The life they built at Ashmore Park had the quality of something that had been well designed, not because it was without difficulty, but because the difficulty, when it arrived, was managed by 2 people who were each, as it turned out, genuinely interested in the particular problem the other was solving. He ran the estate, she ran the household accounts and the estate accounts, and, increasingly, something that was not quite either of those things. A practice of consultation that had begun when Lord Anstruther wrote in May to ask whether she would consider advising on the application of the Yield Protection Clause to his wool contracts. She had written back with the complete instrument, adapted for his contract form, accompanied by a 4-page explanatory document that she had written in the same organized prose she had learned at her father's desk. Lord Anstruther had paid her for it, not what it was worth. Nothing is ever paid what it is worth when the person providing it is a woman in 1814, but something, and she had written the amount into her own account ledger, under her own name, in the cold morning room that was now a warm study with a working window latch and a fire. By 1816, she had advised on 7 contracts for 5 neighboring estates. She had written a general instrument, the formal version of her original clause, extended and annotated for application across multiple agricultural production types, that Mr. White had arranged to have copied and distributed through the network of estate advisors he maintained from his years as a diplomat. The document was circulated under the name E. Cavendish, Ashmore Park, which was not the name she had been born with, but was the name under which her work could travel further than it could under any name she had yet held. Their daughter came in the spring of 1817, and was named Margaret after the Duke's mother, and Catherine after Eleanor's, a combination that produced in practice a child called Meg, who had her father's deliberate stillness and her mother's habit of noticing everything, and who by the age of 2 had developed the specific practice of standing in doorways and assessing rooms before she entered them, which Eleanor recognized, with a warmth she did not attempt to describe, as a native trait. One morning in the summer of 1818, Eleanor was at the desk in the warm study, working through the annotated accounts she had been preparing for a consultation with a new client, a Yorkshire estate whose merchant contract had the kind of systematic risk she could identify from 50 yards, metaphorically speaking, when she became aware that she was being watched. She looked up. Edward was in the doorway with Meg on his arm. Meg was, at this moment, completely absorbed in the business of removing her father's watch from his waistcoat pocket, which she had been attempting to learn to do for 3 weeks and had not yet accomplished. He was letting her try, with the patience he brought to all of Meg's projects, while watching Eleanor at the desk. "You are watching me," Eleanor said. "I am," he agreed. "The cravat," she said. He touched it. It was off-center. "I know," he said. "I was waiting to see how long you would last before you said something. 40 years ago you would have lasted your whole life without anyone saying anything," Eleanor said, and rose, and crossed the room, and straightened it. Meg abandoned the watch project and grabbed Eleanor's finger instead, which was a satisfactory alternative, and Eleanor stood in the doorway of the warm study, with her daughter's hand wrapped around her finger, and her husband's cravat correct at last, and she looked at the desk where the accounts were laid out in the morning light, and she thought, not dramatically, not with the weight of a conclusion, but with the simple recognition of someone who has done the calculation and found it sound, that she had brought everything she had, and she had put it to work, and the work had been worth doing. Outside the window, Ashmore Park lay in the particular quality of an English summer morning, the kind that is warm without pressure and green without effort, and somewhere on the grounds one of the new tenant farmer's children was conducting a loud dispute with a gate that required fixing, and this was a note she would add to tomorrow's list. She pressed a brief kiss to Meg's hair and returned to the desk, and continued.